Hello Art 1, so this will just be a quick video of how you can shade forms using watercolor paint, just in case a couple of you choose to use watercolor paint on your color wheel project. So as you can see, looking at the forms that I've drawn here, I've got my light source identified for the cone and for the cube, and then I've got a separate light source right here for my sphere. Looking at these forms, I have drawn in sort of where my highlights are going to be, as well as my reflected light. And I've drawn on the sphere sort of a line for where that core shadow is going to start to really get dark. You've got your cast shadows sort of on the ground here. Now keep in mind these forms are not perfectly drawn, but the point is for you guys to be able to see a little bit of how to do the shading with watercolors. So first of all, just as with any watercolor, you need to get your color wet. Now I definitely recommend starting on the shadow areas for a couple reasons. First of all, it will help you get a little more used to the medium, because the shadow, as we know, is pretty much one solid value. It does get a little bit lighter as it gets farther away from the form. However, with this first layer, I'm not going to get it as dark as it's even going to be at its darkest point. So right now, I'm literally just going to fill in that shadow. I'll go ahead and fill in the shadow on the cone, because with watercolor, I do want to make sure that I give each thing a little time to dry before I move into the next area. Simply because if you do areas that are touching each other, like if I went into that sphere and started shading on it right now, while the shadow is wet, then my colors or values are just going to run together, and you will end up with something quite muddy versus something that looks like a volumetric form. So once again, on that shadow, I've just done mostly a solid value right now, because I know that I'm going to be working back into that shadow and adding more value closer to the form and letting it remain lighter, getting further away from the form. So now I'm just going to do my shadow for my cube. I'm going to turn my page. You guys probably know by now that I am a big fan of turning the page so that you are using the tip of your brush and so that you have better control over that brush and where the color goes. So again, just going to do primarily one sort of value right now. Knowing that I will go back in with subsequent layers and sort of increase the value in the areas where it needs to be increased. I'm going to turn my page back around now. Now, part of working with watercolors is that you're going to have even more layers than you would with colored pencil. So let's see, right now, the cone shadow is actually the driest. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to my cone. Now, for your color wheel, you may use more than one color per form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start into my cone. I'm going to start in the darker areas. I'm going to start with sort of what could be considered a dark color, but I'm not going to start with it at a dark value yet. And I'm not going to put anything in my reflected light. And I'm just going to let it get lighter as I get toward the highlight. Maybe add a little more water. So then I would just let that layer dry before I do anything else on that cone. So now I'm just going to move on to my cube. Now I know that this area is going to be my darkest area because it is on the far side of my highlight. But since this shadow might still be wet, I'm going to start on this side. Again, not starting super dark yet. Using the tip of my brush. And then as I get closer to the area where the highlight is or where it gets lighter, I'm either going to dry my brush off with a paper towel, or I can add more water. Because what that's going to do is force there to be less pigment to work with. And then I'm just going to go back, sort of in the opposite direction, to push that pigment back towards the areas that are a little darker. So that might be the first part of the cube that I do. Maybe look a little bit at the top of that cube. Just put a little color down, and then mostly water because the top of the cube is definitely the lightest part. And I'm going to be careful right now to not touch the side that I just painted. I'm going to dry my brush off and pick up that little bit of color here because I don't want that color to be there. I want that to be pretty light. So that might be the top of the cube and one side of the cube's first layer. So then on the sphere, the way I would do the sphere would be to paint it wet first. So to get just some good water on there. Still not putting anything down where that highlight is. And now I'm going to erase the line for where my core shadow goes, because I don't want that line to stay visible as I'm working. And now I've kind of memorized where it goes. Finish getting my sphere wet. Making sure that I have more water on the area that are meant to be lighter, and then a little less where it's meant to be darker. And then I'm just going to pick the color that I want to use for this particular form. I think I will use a yellowy orange. And then I'm going to actually turn my page once again so that I am using the tip of my brush on that outer edge. So you can see there it's pretty saturated, but then as I move towards the water, that color gets diffused a little bit. So I'm going basically almost right up to that line for where the reflected light is going to be. And then I'm just going to continue turning my page as I need to, going right up to the pencil line here, and again letting it kind of bleed into the water. Because what this is doing is basically forcing the water to work for you. You're not doing as much work, and then your value is going to get lighter and lighter as you move towards the highlight, simply because there's more water. So then I'm just going to dry my brush a little bit and come back into this area to kind of smooth out the values that I have. Because remember, each time you dry your brush, what you're essentially doing is picking up pigment from your sphere. So you're going to help kind of keep it smooth. You can also use a paper towel or a tissue to pick up some of the excess pigment. Both are perfectly fine ways to do that. So now I've got the beginning of all three of my forms. So then my next step is going to be to erase some of those pencil lines and start into my second layers.